So we've got a really well-coordinated session here today on narratives, and I'd first of all like to thank SNU for arranging the conference, and also to thank Claudia Kim for arranging and coordinating our speakers, because it is so well coordinated. Narrative is so important in international relations. Everything we do as humans, as individuals, we tell our stories about ourselves through narrative. We tell other people, what we're doing in the world through narrative. Everything we do is understood through narrative. So it's so incredibly important in international relations, but it's forgotten all the time. International relations is a very young discipline. It's a very weak discipline. It only started in the 1930s, and it borrowed theories from everywhere. And half of those theories don't actually work. And we know that from the end of the Cold War. We know that the theories are weak because we keep on revising them and keep on thinking up new ways to work out what international relations actually means. But one way, which is constant, is narrative. And it's been there since the beginning, since before the theory started in international relations. Diplomatic history was all about telling stories about what went on. So what we're covering here today is incredibly important, and we've got 4 really good speakers. First of all, we're starting off with Shin-Ae Lee, who's going to be talking about Japan's strategic narratives. Then we've got Jae Chu, who's going to be talking about China's narratives on Korea, diplomatic narratives, an area I'm particularly interested in. Next, we have Kyeon Chung, who's going to be talking about US narratives. And, well, US narratives on Korea are going to become increasingly important over the next few years. And so I'm really interested in hearing this paper. And then finally, we have Claudia Kim, who's going to be talking about South Korea's use of narratives in its understanding of the foreign perceptions of South Korea's victimhood, historical victimhood, which again is going to be really incredibly important. So as a chairperson in this panel, I am going to be doing 2 things. One, I'm going to be interjecting small little Australian narratives about Korea everywhere I can, so get ready for it. But secondly, hey, I'm just a timekeeper, and that's what I'm going to be doing. So at exactly 9:35, we're going to start with our first speaker, and then at 9:55, our next speaker, 10:15, our next speaker, and 10:35, our last speaker. And then at 10:55, we're going to have the perfect amount of time for you guys to ask questions, because that's what a conference is all about. It's about you guys asking questions and the people up here sharing their ideas and their understandings of international relations. So it is 9:34 now, dead on time. Please welcome Shin-Ae Lee.
So, okay, thank you everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for having me today. So before I begin, I should mention that there may be some. So before I begin, I think I should mention that there are some updates compared to the abstract I have submitted. I appreciate your kind understanding. So today, I will present the overview of my research, some preliminary findings, and its future direction. So I have recently observed some nuanced but meaningful shift in how Japan frames South Korea within its free and open Indo-Pacific FOIP narratives. So this observation has led me to the broad question: how has Japan's stance and perception of South Korea as an Indo-Pacific partner evolved, and what is the rationale behind this shift? So first, I started by reviewing more general research on Korea-Japan relations. Many studies have pointed out that IR theories often fall short in explaining the patterns of cooperation and conflict between the 2 countries. And so as you well know, North Korea provocation or rise of China or economic interdependence or shared liberal values have not been enough to sustain closer cooperation between the 2 countries. And some studies pointed out additional factors like US engagement or leadership changes But I regard this more as a necessary conditions that lay the groundwork for more fundamental elements to ultimately shape bilateral relations. And as I examine these studies, one fundamental question came to mind. Why haven't shared values or shared interests been enough to facilitate or sustaining bilateral cooperation? So indeed, shared values and shared interests have always been there, even when their relations were strained, but they haven't enough to build a shared identity or what we might call a sense of witness. Instead, the two countries' identities have often crashed, shaped by conflicting historical interpretations and incompatible national values. So the understanding identities between the two countries are crucial for analyzing their bilateral relations, as these identity fundamentally shapes how each country perceive each other and how approach the other. In particular, the absence of a shared identity or a sense of witness can be seen as a key factor behind the difficulty in sustaining bilateral relations. This is because experience from the other cooperative communities like EU, NATO, and ASEAN, they commonly suggest that while shared interest matters, but they alone are insufficient, and shared identity is essential for maintaining cooperation. So, and a sense of we identity is especially significant because it encourages reciprocity and makes cooperation more likely to emerge within groups. So this identity is often reinforced by perceived similarities. And one important way of fostering it is through the compelling joint narratives. So although I think it may be too early to talk about a shared identity or witness between South Korea and Japan, but I think it can still possible to look at their narratives as a factor that might influence the dynamics of bilateral relations with a focus on recent improvements. So with this in mind, this study aims to empirically examine the narratives of the two countries, especially whether converging Indo-Pacific narratives between Japan and South Korea translate into enhanced bilateral relations. So this study first traced and compared the Indo-Pacific narratives of Japan and South Korea, exploring how Japan has framed its stance and approach to South Korea, and examined the recent development in South Korea's own Indo-Pacific narratives. And by analyzing this development of these narratives alongside policy and action changes, the research explores the possible link between narratives and actions, and finally also considered the implication of these developments for the future trajectory of the two countries' fragile and uncertain relationship. So this study conducts narrative analysis of Japan and South Korea's strategic narratives of the Indo-Pacific between August 2016 and December 2024. Here, strategic narratives offer a valuable framework for deepening understanding of how Japanese and South Korean government defined and pursue their identity, values, and objectives in the Indo-Pacific context, and they also allow for nuanced analysis of convergence, alignment, or gaps between the two countries' orientation. So I focus on the period from Abe's introduction, Japanese Prime Minister Abe's introduction of FOIP up through the Yoon Suk-yeol administrations just before the declaration of martial law to capture leadership changes in Japan, South Korea, and the United States, along with key regional security challenges, while FOIP remained Japan's central vision. And the narratives were examined based on the Japan and South Korea's foreign and security-related official documents, statements, and leaders' speeches. And also, I tried to analyze the influence of narratives on bilateral relations, and I employed process tracing, which helps identify key causal mechanism by examining diagnostic evidence across temporal sequence while carefully evaluating alternative explanations and counterfactual scenarios. Additionally, I'm planning to conduct interviews with relevant experts and government officials in Japan to add further depth to the analysis. So first, I want to briefly explain why understanding Japanese perception of South Korea and their bilateral relationship within the Indo-Pacific context is crucial. So since former Prime Minister Abe introduced the concept of FOIP, it has been Japan's central pillar of Japan's national security and foreign policy. And under this vision, Japan established itself as an Indo-Pacific nation and pursue a range of initiatives across economic, diplomatic, and security, and to achieve its core objectives of promoting a free and open international order based on the rule of law. As Japan recognized it cannot do it alone, it has actively reaching out to many countries for cooperation and frequently incorporated FOIP messaging in its narratives. And especially after the first Trump administration adopted its own FOIP, US and Japan's Indo-Pacific narratives converged, and their relations have been firmly grounded in shared Indo-Pacific vision. And also at the same time, more countries like Australia, ASEAN, France, the EU, and Canada have also developed their own approach to the Indo-Pacific engagement and deepened cooperation with Japan. However, South Korea has been an exception. For example, Japan's 2019 Diplomatic Blue Book names many partners like the US, Australia, India, New Zealand, ASEAN, and European countries, and also Pacific Island nations as a key partner for FOIP, but South Korea wasn't mentioned. And Japan has generally refrained from engaging with South Korea as an Indo-Pacific partners, while repeatedly expressing its interest in cooperation on issues beyond the Korean Peninsula and carefully floated the idea of cooperation within the Indo-Pacific framework. But things have changed since late 2022. Japan's security documents, the National Security Strategy, released in December 2022, clearly states Japan's intention to strengthen security cooperation with South Korea as part of its efforts to advance FOIP. And also in 2023 Diplomatic Blue Book, South Korea was listed for the first time as one of the key partners for FOIP. Since then, Japan has consistently framed South Korea as a crucial partner in this vision, and this shift is evidenced across various official documents and statements, and also political leader speech. So as you can see here, Kishida mentioned South Korea as a key partner for FOIP in his new vision for free and open Indo-Pacific. So these words collectively signifies Japan's welcoming and embrace of South Korea as an Indo-Pacific partner. As an alternative explanation for this change, U.S. leadership can be considered. However, that alone does not fully explain the changes. As I mentioned earlier, Japan's Indo-Pacific messaging toward South Korea remained measured until late 2022. This means despite the Biden administration's increasing efforts since early 2021 to advance the US-ROK-Japan trilateral partnerships and help repair ROK-Japan ties by holding more frequent dialogues or encouraging both countries to strengthen their ties, but still Japan remained cautious in its approach towards South Korea. So as a more fundamental driver, I would like to focus on South Korea's Indo-Pacific narratives. Notably, under the Yoon administration, South Korea's narrative have increasingly converged with those of Japan and reflected more cooperative stance toward FOIP. That's a quite shift from the previous Moon administration. When FOIP was first announced, it was somewhat unclear to many countries, including South Korea, and South Korea stayed cautious, and that cautious continued even after the US established its own FOIP framework. A notable example came in 2017 after the US ROC summit. At the time, a South Korean administration resisted linking the US ROC alliance to the Indo-Pacific framework, saying Japan is trying to build Indo-Pacific line to link Japan, Australia, India, and the United States, but we don't have to join it. Later, the government softened its stance and suggests that additional consultation would be needed before making any decision. But in the end, South Korea reassured Washington that it was ready to cooperate on the US vision in line with its New Southern policy and mainly pursue functional cooperation such as COVID-19 vaccine distribution without formally embracing the Indo-Pacific concept. By contrast, the Yoon administration signaled a significant shift by unveiling its own Indo-Pacific strategy in late 2022. For the first time, South Korea defined itself as an Indo-Pacific nation and expressed its intention to cooperate with partners sharing this vision, explicitly identify Japan as a key partner. Former President Yoon also pleased with Prime Minister Kishida to advance a free and open Indo-Pacific together. And moreover, South Korea acknowledged the challenges to universal values, norms, and regional order built on them. And at the same time, it clearly committed to defending a rules-based order through close cooperation with value-based partners. Although South Korea has introduced its own term, free, peaceful, and prosperous Indo-Pacific region, rather than directly use FOIP, its narratives are showing increasing convergence with Japan's, such as both countries seeing themselves as Indo-Pacific nations, share a threat perception, and also commonly expressing its commitment to work with value-based partners to address these challenges. So alongside these converging narratives, both Korea-Japan relations and the broader Korea-Japan-US trilateral partnerships have improved significantly. South Korea and Japan has repeatedly pleaded to deepen their cooperation in the Indo-Pacific context, most notably in light of their shared standing as Indo-Pacific nations and their shared vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific. The US ROC-Japan trilateral partnership has made significant progress. Importantly, these developments have not been limited to rhetoric. They have been followed by substantial actions. While progress has been somewhat slower between Japan and South Korea, but it's still made some important steps toward laying the groundwork for more concrete cooperation in the future. So while further research, including more narrative analysis and tracing and interviews is necessary to more clearly support causal relationship, my current observation suggests that converging Indo-Pacific narratives between South Korea and Japan to deepen cooperation between two countries by broadening their common ground, encouraging Japan to reach out to South Korea, and they also could strengthen their trilateral partnership with United States. My point here is not whether South Korea should adopt Indo-Pacific narratives. Rather, for South Korea and Japan, these preliminary findings suggest that greater coordination of their narratives beyond ad hoc policy measures will be necessary to secure long-standing cooperation. And also, these findings suggest that narratives convergence can serve as an important enabler of middle power cooperation, which relies on persuasion and consensus building rather than a single dominant power with resources or authority to lead. Finally, two questions remain. to further reinforce my current findings. So first, counterfactual questions is what lies ahead of South Korea's Indo-Pacific narratives under the new administration and what implication this might have. Early signs already indicate that a notable shift. For instance, the term Indo-Pacific has been omitted from several recent government communications, including president's statements and those related to trilateral joint exercise, while the new administration still appears to be signaling a favorable stance toward Japan. And this study also should consider an alternative explanations that Japan's shift stance and recent improvement in bilateral relations may have resulted primarily from former President Yoon's controversial decision to address the forced labor issue. I will explore these questions and further deepen my analysis beyond the early observations shared today, and I am glad to hear any comments and further discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jae Chu. I'm with Kyung University, and I'm so happy to, have this chance to share my findings and studies about Chinese diplomatic narratives on Korea, and especially focusing on the Xi Jinping's era. I'm glad, I was assigned to Xi Jinping's era because otherwise I would have too much to talk about. Because narratives before Xi Jinping was very, very fine and good, very malign and gentle. But, coming to Xi Jinping's era, we all know that he's been quite hawkish, and, the CCP has been really, really pointy and thorny with their messages. And, narratives in the studies of international relations or diplomacy is really, really important, just like Professor Robinson pointed out earlier. Going back to my college years when I was first exposed to the, international relations literature 40 years ago, narratives were really, really important. They deserved a lot of attention because what the leaders had said was basically the, principal lines of diplomatic policy and strategies and so forth. What they said was really meant to be. But nowadays, I'm glad, Dr. Lee Shin-e pointed out, nowadays, we doubt ourselves, whether the, narratives do necessarily translate into action. I would think that we see too much conversion of narratives and action as a linkage or link causal factor in decision-making process. So that's the part we have to be really sorry about. But anyways, when China delivers its narratives, they do mean it, especially not the positive ones. When they present a positive narrative, they don't really mean it because that doesn't necessarily translate into action. But when they speak with negative narratives, you better be watch out. They to a lot of extent they do mean it, and they do translate into action. So going to my presentation, there's during the Xi Jinping era, we know that he came into power in 2012 as the leader of this party. So I like to start with year 2012 as my starting point, and he became the president of the country in 2013. So I guess we have to be, define his starting point as in 2012 when he assumed the leadership of the party. So the first term was between 2012 and 2017. The second term, 2017 and 2022, and third term was when he assumed the third leadership of the party. Third term of the leadership of the party in 2022 and to present. And I present these three terms because, according to these period, his narratives have changed over the years too. But at one point, there was a really positive era especially during his early leadership, and between 2012 and 2015. And then there was a new framing of the narratives attempts, in year 2016 and 2022, respectively. So twice we see a drastic shift in Chinese narratives on Korea. And since 2016, Chinese narratives have been very overbearing and intimidating to South Korea. And we'll see that later because of the deployment of THAAD and the aftermath, and they didn't really like the way we build up our relationship, not only with the United States, but also with Japan as a trilateral cooperation that, Dr. Lee had earlier pointed out. But before I go into some case studies, I'd like to share my findings about how over the years China has built up its narratives, and there are two pathways of doing so. One is bottom-up approach, and I would coin it as a smoking gun approach. It usually starts with ambassador of China in a foreign country, and in this case, it would be Chinese ambassador to Korea, and he would pull the trigger first, and then that's the exact same message that the ambassador had delivered would be spoken by Chinese MOFA or a spokesperson, and it would be you see the same rhetoric or similar rhetorics coming from the Politburo members and even at the end of the day, the top leadership as in Xi Jinping. And the other way is through the media outlets first, especially from the Chinese Communist Party's mouthpiece, like People's Daily or Global Times or Huanchu Shibao. Their editorials are they will be the triggering point, and editorials they would set the tone, and their message will be delivered through the either from top down or bottom up in that fashion. Yep. So if there's a proclamation from the editorial, then usually Chinese MOFA would take it over, and a spokesperson during his or her press briefings, most likely to be questioned, and this is where we can see the MOFA would be first delivering the editorial message from the editorial and reiterating the core message from the editorial, and later on, in the activities of exchanges between high-level government officials between China and foreign countries, Politburo members would be speaking the same language, and eventually at the summit meetings, top leadership as in Xi Jinping will be speaking the same words. And how narratives of the CCP is built, or what is it based on? You look at the literatures of CCP that contains a lot of narratives. Most of them, they start with narratives too. So there we can make an inference. And when you're reading them, especially during the first 2 or 3 paragraphs, you'll be reading these words that'll be repeating in the first 2 or 3 paragraphs. China would like to draw a conclusion from its own historical experiences, and what they mean by it is the lessons for their judgment. And Guoqing, the current state of national affairs, in that context or through that lens, we like to China will base its decision and judgments. And basically, what it means is by this statement is, the basis of China's perception. And the ideological aspect is not omitted either. Usually in the last sentence of the narratives would emphasize the importance of upholding the ideology that CCP has been pursuing over the years, and to reflect that in its narratives, it usually states that combine China's situation in the context of basic principles of Marxism and oppose Chinese communist ideology and so forth. So basically, this is the frame of the Chinese narratives. It is basically dictated by the ideology that it has been upholding over the years. And my assessment is that the logic is simple. When China is confronted with challenges, they first review the history and see where's China is situated, and how the current of how this challenge fits into the current state of affairs, and develop its own narratives in the context of communist ideology, and act in such way. Narratives during the first period of Xi Jinping, I would say, between 2012 and 2015, and the narratives is quite, I would say during this period, like it's pointed out earlier, it was rather mild and malign. So I would coin it as charm offensive narratives during this period, in the context of China-Korea relations, excluding China-U.S. relations or China-Europe relations, or China-Japan, for that matter. And one of the driving factors behind this malign, or charm offensive narratives is personal affection between President Park and Xi Jinping. They inaugurated into presidency in the same year, 2013, and their personal relationship goes as far back as to 2008, when Park was at the time she was the head of the ruling party, and Xi Jinping was the vice president of the state. And Park Geun-hye, believe it or not, she was one of the most popular figures in China, and I would say, her biography and her work was translated the most, if not the least, and she comes as close as President Kim Dae-jung, in that matter. And Park's first visit to Beijing was in June of 2013. There was a state visit, which was for the first time in years for South Korean president at the time. And Xi Jinping made a reciprocal visit to Seoul the next year, and he skipped North Korea and came to South Korea first, and then made a lot of buzz. And the next year in the September of 2014, Park made it to the World War II Victory Military Parade that was held in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, which was very controversial at the time. And as a result of our visit, the hotline between Seoul and Beijing was connected. And I pointed this out because later on, this is a really significant event that transpired to. And still continuing the first year of between 2012 and 2015, cooperation for North Korea's denuclearization really rose to a new level as a result of close personal relationship between the two leaders. And following the third North Korea's nuclear test, we all know that Beijing adopted its own sanctions on North Korea for the first time, and it was an independent and unilateral one. And also, between the end of the 2013 and 2014, there were a lot of official statements coming from Chinese officials that supports, Park's unification bonanza theory. Unification would benefit everybody and benefit Korea and so forth. And that supportive, statements came from not only Politburo members, politicians, but also, military personnel of China, which was quite unusual. And on the economic front, Chinese narrative went on to emphasize that the good relationship opened up a new chapter for the two countries, and an FTA was signed in November of 2014, and came into effect in December of 2015. And Beijing extended invitation to Seoul to join, the AIIB, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and Belt and Road initiatives in 2014 and 2015, respectively. But comes 2015, 2016, things didn't go quite well, and bad things started to bubble during this period. And because there was a rumor saying that that could be deployed to South Korea, and that rumors started to leak out in Washington, and it started out around 2012, and we wonder why Washington started to leak out such rumor or planning by the DoD, and because usually in the past, DoD or Washington never talk about deploying their weapons or weapon systems to South Korea. Everything is very confidential. It doesn't go through our custom because of SOFA agreement between the two countries. So as of today, even today, we don't know what is deployed in U.S. military bases in Korea. That's how secret they keep it. But with respect to THAAD, they started to leak out this possible deployment and toying with the idea of deploying THAAD to South Korea. And that caught the attention of China in 2014. And Chinese ambassador to South Korea first responded to this rumor. And he came out hard, very hard. He said, if you deploy, THAAD, then that is basically he's saying, I'll deliver his remarks later. He's saying, that it'll destroy, bilateral relationship. And in July 2016, what drove the wedge with respect to THAAD deployment was that I told you earlier, how a line between Beijing and Seoul was established, right, as a result of President Park's visit, attendance of, military parade in 2014. And when the matter was urgent, after following the, fourth nuclear test by North Korea, she picked up the phone and gave a ring to President Xi, and he didn't pick up the phone. This is an official presentation, so I'm not going to go into gender issue here. But we know what happens when you don't pick up the phone. Anyways, but yeah, so it definitely apparently upset President Park, and it took a month for Xi Jinping to pick up the phone, and she mentioned about what should he do about North Korea, how are we going to deal with this matter, and Xi Jinping just gave her an answer that wouldn't satisfy her, and answer that is not related. He said, don't deploy THAAD, and she got a little upset there. Yeah. Anyways, I'm running out of time here, and new narratives with that. We all know what happened. I'll just briefly go over, just share the slide. And new framing of narratives came in 2022. This is interesting. Global Times editorial delivered, two editorials before the presidential election and right after the presidential election. And It says, okay, although, the president would change, nothing changes between the two countries. And so basically, uh, uh, China was saying to elected President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol at the time to upholding, inherit the policy that Moon Jae-in had agreed with China, especially in the context of, THAAD issue. And there are more narratives here, but since I'm running out of time, and the next day of the after the result came out from the presidential election, uh, the editorial simply said, uh, don't get warning was don't get too close to the United States. And overbearing and intimidating narratives, there are plenty, especially, the former ambassador to China, Xing Haiming, is a great example here. He's stationed here between 2020 and 2024. And, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, he's been in power since 2013, and he's quite hawkish and assertive with his narratives. And Xi Jinping, we don't need to mention here. And going to, THAAD issue here, and like I said earlier, in November 2014, ambassador to South Korea, then it was Cho Go-hong, and he said, the deployment of THAAD could destroy the relationship between the two countries. And in June of 2019, this is when, G20 summit meeting was held in Osaka, Japan. And before, Moon Jae-in's face, Xi Jinping said, bilateral relationship should not be influenced by external pressure. So basically, he's telling President Moon that you get your act straight together and, be independent, autonomous with your decision making, and not to be influenced by the United States, which was quite a disgrace here. But anyways, there are a lot of things like that, and 2021, June, July, June's remark was quite astonishing, especially it came from, Chinese minister, Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Yep. You can see it here. And he'll be more assertive in coming into 2022 and 2023. Editorial basically criticized Yoon Suk-yeol's successful, visit to Washington. It was a state visit, and the editorial title was "National Dignity of South Korean Diplomacy Has Been Shattered." Anyways, but yep, okay, thank you, and. There are plenty of more, but what I'm saying is, basically, okay, it really, their narratives reflected into, policy and policy action here. For instance, the most notable one is 2023, and 2024, when they dropped double suspension as the, one of the formulas for denuclearization of North Korea, and double processes was dropped also in 2024 as a formula for denuclearization of North Korea. And the meanings of narratives, there are plenty, and hope you just take a look. And okay, hope you understand.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Kuyan Jung. I'm from Gangwon National University. Actually, I slightly changed my title so that it can reflect better reflect my argument, but contents are the same. So my argument actually, what is the condition under which a U.S. retrenchment does not really give fears to U.S. allies? So that goes to my title, When Retrenchment Reassures, and I am emphasizing the role of strategic narrative and how United States actually respect allies' interest, and how it is applied to the case of Nixon administration. And actually, this Nixon administration has been researched many times these days because of its analogies, seemingly analogy to Trump administrations. And when I look at this literatures about Nixon, and there are actually many articles and books, and I was wondering whether I can make a new conclusion out of this, but this is my research question. So under what condition can strategic narrative override structural expectations about alliance abandonment, given that Nixon's administration's experience? And how did Nixon's retrenchment and rapprochement with China reassure rather than weaken U.S. alliances in East Asia? So this is the background. Actually, my presentation might be a little bit quick. Given that this is a kind of archive work, there are not that many archives and statements, and compared to Professor Chu's kind of recent kind of discussion. So yeah. So this is the background. As all know, when you look at this Nixon administrations and his rapprochement with China, this is the background. The United States domestically faced Vietnam War fatigue and, of course, fiscal kind of a strain. And also, the United States observed this Sino-China Soviet Union split. So given that the structural changes and domestic actually strain, Nixon administration pursued retrenchment in East Asia, which actually represented by withdrawal of U.S. forces out of South Korea and burden sharing request to China, to South Korea and Japan, and also at the same time rapprochement with China. Actually, this rapprochement with China at those times are kind of applied these days by Trump administration. So that's another reason why Nixon administration has been recalled this day very often, like a reverse Kissinger or reverse Nixon strategy to Russia these days. So given that this retrenchment and rapprochement with China, like traditional realism, like structural realism practice, the retrenchment is a kind of symbol of decline of United States, and U.S. allies might perceive it as a kind of weakening commitment of United States in East Asia's security management. And ultimately, most of realism argues that it will weaken alliance cohesion. But when you look at actually what happens in East Asia in 1960s and 70s, those East Asian ally systems remain intact. So it is not a matter of dichotomous kind of conclusion, but a relatively stable way East Asian allies has been maintained. So this is kind of time flow in those times. 1969, Nixon doctrine has been kind of declared. In 1970, national security a memorandum, 48, which actually dictated that U.S. troops withdrawal from the South Korea. In 71, Kissinger's trip to Beijing. In 72, Nixon visit to China, and Shanghai Communique has been concluded. So over this processes, South Korea and Japan, U.S. allies in East Asia, have much more reasons to be more less secure and feel more threatened by the fear of abandonment in the East alliances system. So there are many existing literatures regarding this phenomenons, and we have and structural realism has been actually dominated the interpretation of this event. Retrenchment, as many structural realists argues and predict, great power decline. It means actually great power declines, and proteges like U.S. allies might feel the fear of abandonment, which means that in recent cases, countries are likely to take the strategy of hedging or start another types of realignment with another great powers. In case of East Asia, China. And instead, in addition to the structural realist argument, there are alliance theories, which Snyder emphasized abandonment kind of fears, which emphasize that not only the distribution of power matters, but also perception about commitment of all alliances matter as well. So that that actually create the gap actually between the theories and actual phenomena, what happens in 1970s. So I figured this study of strategic narrative can fill the gap. In other words, it is not just about materials, distribution of material capability, but also the power of a rhetoric actually reframe the policies of retrenchment so that they can be reassured. Actually, there are very few research about the role of strategic narratives in East Asian allies. Evelyn Goh and Victor Cha, from his book, they mention slightly about this role of strategic narrative and maintain U.S. alliance system in East Asia. But they have not fully kind of developed the theories. They just provide these anecdotal cases in 1970s and 1980s. So I tried to delve into more about this role of strategic narrative in this article. So my argument is that narratives enabled retrenchment, reassure rather than erode trust and confidence between allies. And theories from international relations, there are not that many kind of security-wise oriented theories about role of the narratives. I adapted from this media and other international relations broadly defined theories to kind of discuss the role of strategic narratives. So strategic narrative construct shared meanings and orders and stabilities, and more in terms of in the context of ally narratives reassured by allies by providing coherence meanings about what they are actually provide orders and what kind of meaning of the orders they try to provide in the world. Actually, this part is quite comparison. I will talk about later, but when you look at this era, this is actually another project I'm gonna do after this papers. When you compare Nixon and Trump, which is pretty no defense for Trump, but you can see that how this coherency of narrative about what kind of world order they actually bring to the world is actually making countries more fear. Not just about the Trump, but actually the strategic narrative of Trump. So I will discuss more of that. Retrenchment components are similar, but actually what is actually coherence about this strategic narratives is pretty different between Nixon and Trump. So yeah, providing coherence, world view, and world orders. And it is kind of a long-term strategy, not just about this time, but providing the stability and global leadership in spite of retrenchment is a kind of key to maintain this retrenchment, reassure allies. And in case of East Asian allies, there was actually the third one, this aligning with allies' own interests is a kind of more important factors that reassure those allies. When you look at this, I go this first. When you look at the South Korea and Japan cases, initially, South Korea, when actually they received the news about this retrenchment, of course, there is an initial alarm about U.S. withdrawal from South Korean territory. But what actually reassured was this: the Park Chung-hee administration has a chance to develop indigenous defense capability, which is known as the Yulgok Project. In Japan, recognizing Japan's role in the regions or recognizing its status in the region has been the key factors that reassure Japan in spite of the retrenchment strategies. So that's the kind of theories that I am going to analyze, this East Asian theory. So when you look at these two determinants and how the strategic narrative has been transitioned from retrenchment to, at the bottom box, sustain the U.S. leadership and regional stability, actually kind of reassure the entire U.S. allies in East Asia. So when you, the first kind of archival work, which is the announcement in announcement of Guam, 1969, is a kind of Guam doctrine, Nixon doctrine. U.S. will honor treaty commitment, but expect allies to provide more manpower for their own defense, which sounds similar to Trump. But this is kind of initial kind of remark by the Nixon administrations. The next one here at the bottom, so U.S. will keep all of this treaty commitment, which will provide a shield if a nuclear power threatens. But we shall look to the nation directly threatened to assume the primary responsibility of providing the manpower for its defense, which is also very similar to Albridge Corby or President Trump these days. So this is the first kind of strategy narrative that U.S. provided to East Asian allies, retrenchment. The next one was the kind of self-reliance of alliances system. So retrenchment from the U.S. Perspective is kind of transition to self-reliance of U.S. allies from the protégés perspectives. So burden sharing has been kind of framed as a self-reliance. As you can see from this, we shall, as I mentioned, and leadership assurance. The first remaining will provide not only the substantial U.S. capacity, but also clear evidence of U.S. state commitment, which is represented by a letter to Park Chung-hee from Nixon administration. So it is not just about retrenchment, but as a transition to a narrative of self-reliance, United States has kind of framed differently of this retrenchment strategy. And another archival voices. Actually, this is my first time that I do this archival work, so I couldn't find many. But there are very many kind of evidences that show that this transition. Next to Park Chung-hee and this to Sato, Prime Minister of the Japan, actually shows that how United States kind of reframe kind of retrenchment into a way to elevate Japan's role in the regions, especially from the second one. Our purpose is not to diminish Japan's role, but elevate it. We believe Japan should take a greater regional role commensurate with its own economic strengths, which is actually similar to the current Trump administration as well. So anyway, this is the way actually they kind of make retrenchment less create fear of abandonment, but actually retrenchment reassure allies more kind of respecting their own strategic interest of U.S. allies. So my brief conclusion, I welcome more comments from audiences and discussants about theoretical and archive kind of evidence kind of wise. But my kind of brief conclusion is this: retrenchment doesn't automatically weaken alliances. It is not a dichotomous choices. And it is possible because Nixon reframed retrenchment as a stability, self-reliance, and leadership, not just about abandoning alliances in East Asia. And the condition under which narrative reassure allies only if the coherent vision has been sustained and provided, backed by tangible reassurance mechanism, as in the case of South Korea's military aid, and allow South Korea to develop indigenous military capability, and aligned with allies' aspiration to rise up as a kind of regional leaders, as in the case of Japan. So. Back to the kind of discussion, comparative reflections in today. Nixon and Biden are pretty similar in the sense that retrenchment framed as a stability. Biden, of course, it was in the middle of great power competition. Also mentions about burden sharing, but provide the commitment that United States were sided with allies and partners. And Trump, of course, very different. Emphasis only burden sharing and economic transaction, and didn't provide the coherent strategic goals and narratives, which actually one of the reasons why we are having this abandonment fears in East Asian allies, and not just East Asia, but not NATO as well. So you can see these comparative reflections in how another kind of project that compare Nixon and Trump in the contemporary era. So I'll stop here. I'll welcome more comments and questions.
So we've got plenty of time for questions, and I hope you all have a lot of questions. I'm going to throw out a few questions for our panel just to get us all started. So for our first presentation, I'm interested in the methodology used. In particular, the difference between how do you reconcile interviews and official documents? Because when people speak to you in an interview, the narratives can be almost personal. They can be totally different from the official narratives. And so you've got two different narratives going here, the official narrative, which is public rhetoric, and you've got the individual narratives that, sometimes when people speak to you, they try to tell you things that make you feel better. And it's just so personal that it's hard to reconcile the two. So I'm interested in how you actually are planning on doing that. It's yeah, something I've come up with in my past research as well. For our second presentation, yeah, I really like this topic. So you stated that Chinese narratives are really coordinated and highly predictable. But then why do so many countries have problems dealing with China? Um, and maybe this is coming from reading too much Western media and paying too much attention to Western media. But many countries face challenges in dealing with China's foreign policy, and sometimes it's not so consistent and not so clear to those states. So I'd like to know if it is so coordinated and predictable, why are we having problems, and in particular, who's to blame for that? Because there's another major power out there that sometimes disrupts those narratives. My third question, is there any way in which retrenchment can be seen positively? Because you mentioned it's not dichotomous. I'd like to explore where it can be seen as maybe even positive. And lastly, so you put out that dichotomous position of being either a great victim or an elite power. But some countries are great victims and also elite powers. So, such as Israel or Ireland have both really put forward their ideas of victimhood, but they're very strong states and they are, well, oppressors. Well, Israel, an oppressor in its own mind, and Ireland, well, very effective and has a very strong foreign policy, pursuing its aims as a victim. So, could Korea actually use victimhood to achieve its foreign policy aims rather than having to give them up and pursue a elite power status? So, you want to answer? And then we'll turn to the audience for questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for your wonderful question. So I think government documents or statements often sometimes it's quite positive. They share positive pictures about relations compared to the real world relations. So what I want to do is compare the narratives and documents and statements and leader speech to actual government related persons interview to find some sort of alignment or gaps and compare them and find some trends or nuance or the level of commitment or disengagement and find some trends in narratives.
So you're looking to bring them together, like to get confirmation?
Yes, yes, that's kind of.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. I always found that really hard to do. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Robertson. That's a great question. Uh, yeah, my presentation could sound a little bit controversial here. If Chinese narrative is well coordinated and predictable, then what's up with the consequences? Yeah, the logic is right there. The consequences should be predictable and coordinated too, right? But in a lot of cases with China, they're not, unfortunately. So, so this is where the difficulty comes from. Definitely, just like I said earlier, does narratives really translate into action? This is where it gets all twisted and difficult with Chinese case. You know, uh, if the narratives are coordinated and predictable, then we can predict the consequences, or consequences could be foreseeable, or we can envision ourselves within the framework of the rules and laws and so forth, right? The rule of the game is pretty simple, right? It wouldn't go beyond international law, or our common sense. But in a lot of cases with China, for instance, with that, who would have thought that millions of customers would boycott China, Korean products, and without any directives from the Chinese government, they will still manage to ban all these entertainment or K-pop related activities and so forth, right? Without official documents, it is at their discreet that they can make decisions, and the actions they take, or the penalty they impose on us is really unpredictable. I guess we could say the same thing with Trump administration nowadays. His narratives are out there, but the consequences are totally beyond our imagination nowadays. So I guess we can make a reference here too, and probably analog this to Trump's case. But anyways, yeah. So I guess that'll be my answer to your question.
Thank you for your good comments. Actually, I'm actually working on U.S. foreign policy for a long time, but retrenchment has been, from South Korea's perspective, has been kind of negatively received. But your question is actually kind of thought-provoking. Yeah, it could be positive, but in the context of U.S. ROK alliances, or even U.S.-Japan alliances system, it can be positively received if only if it depends on domestic politics, I guess. If there is a kind of division of political polarizations or partisan politics, especially whether there is a kind of gap between political elite or public level, whether that country can continue the relationship with the United States and strengthen alignment, or pursue more autonomy or alignment with other great powers. If there is a kind of big disparity and discussions, and then retrenchment may not be received in a negative way. It's kind of another option. It can be kind of received as another option, actually. That is a kind of discussion in South Korea today. So I guess that's a kind of...
Yeah, I'm really interested in that as well. And one of the things which I've noticed in a lot of the Korean press is that idea that, very realist sort of approach that if you give up on the United States, you have to turn to China and you need to hedge with China. But there's also the idea of neutrality, which really doesn't get discussed all that much. And there's a few government documents put out, well, government research papers put out about that in the last few years. And I find that really interesting. The idea of neutrality is something which is getting discussed globally in the context of Ukraine as well. So it's a really interesting area. Thank you for your answer. Claudia.
Yes. Thank you for your question. I think the problem for South Korea is not necessarily its identification as a victim, but but rather more like its preoccupation with these ultimate victim status that has this lack of nuanced worldview. And if you look at how politicians talk about different countries and Korea's victimhood, it's really black and white. There is like zero room for nuance anywhere. And I think that is not conducive to kind of the worldview that states need in order to strive for leadership as an elite power. I think for Japan, I think Japan is actually trying to achieve both at the same time. It wants to be a great victim, but it also is an elite power and is actually quite successful in terms of establishing leadership in the Indo-Pacific. And of course, that comes with consequences of its own, which is the fact that it alienates its immediate neighbors, including South Korea and China. So it sort of seeks leadership by aligning with the liberal international order. and pursuing elite status that way, but it also at the same time it is quite increasingly quite assertive about its own victimhood, and it is increasingly assertive about challenging the victimhood of Korea and China, for example. But I think ultimately what happens is that it depends on the recognition from third parties. I think in the case of South Korea and Japan, it's the Western core. Whether they are willing to accommodate or deny certain victimhood claims, I think it sort of depends on these external powers. And I think Israel is an interesting case because it has this really strong support of the Western core, although at the same time, Israel, in some ways, faces a similar problem with Japan because it pursues its own victimhood, and that alienates Israel's neighbors in the Middle East, right? So it's kind of like Japan making strong claims about its own victimhood and alienates its immediate neighbors. So I think there is this status paradox, when it comes to the pursuit of victimhood. Yeah, but I should definitely think more about your question. Thank you.
Really looking forward to that book. I think it's going to be a really good read. And I was also wondering whether you're going to do anything about oppressor guilt in the book as well, because the other side of it, rather than being a victim, some countries have oppressor guilt and they make that impact their foreign policy. Are you going to cover that as well?
So I briefly talk about Germany as part of the Western core that holds special meaning for both Japan and South Korea. For South Korea, Germany has this very special meaning because Germany's example allows South Korea to be like, hey, Japan, look at Germany, like look at what it does, and you should, follow its example, right? At the same time, for Japan, Japan is very annoyed by the constant comparisons with Germany. They even talk about it on their foreign ministry website. It leads the Q&A saying, can we compare Germany and Japan? And the foreign ministry's answer is no, we can't compare these two countries because the contexts are so different. So I do discuss Germany a little bit in the context of how, a country that represents guilt, right, can sort of affect these status pursuits of Korea and Japan.
Awesome, thank you. I can see some hands itching to go up, so please.
Hi, my name is Jae-young Kim, assistant professor from San Diego State University. I have one question or comments for each presenters. So first one is for Dr. Lee. So it's a very interesting project. So my question is that one country can hold multiple narratives at the same time. So in your presentation, your focus is about the Indo-Pacific narrative, but it seems like there is a contestation between Indo-Pacific narrative and victimhood narrative in South Korean society. So I'm wondering how this narrative contestation will affect the possibility of cooperation between South Korea and Japan. And also, it is very interesting to see this kind of trend. I mean, the South Korea and Japan are the two outstanding cases that show the highest level of anti-China sentiment these days, according to many cross-national data. So, if you maybe I want to hear about your idea about how this factor will affect the cooperation between the two countries. And the question for Dr. Chu is that, yeah, so I think that the 2016 THOT deployment was a really big critical juncture in the relationship between these two countries. So we are very well aware of how South Korea turned toward anti-China direction after the deployment. So my question is about how this event affected Chinese policymakers' perception about Korea and its strategic narrative about its national interest within East Asia. And my question for Dr. Zhang is that it was really interesting argument that you bring a strategic narrative and try to challenge the structural realist argument about retrenchment can undermine the cohesion of the alliance. But at least based on your presentation, but when you talk about the reassurance part, it is more like the material or fiscal security guarantees provided by the US, like the nuclear umbrella, military modernization program assistance. So my suggestion is that if we really want to frame this paper a more narrative-focused one, it is possible, we can try some kind of tracing about narrative evolution of the US side and how it became to incorporate the security concerns of its alliance partners. For instance, if we look at the Park Chung-hee's official and private statements in 1972, he was really desperate about US-China rapprochement and its negative impact on the rivalry between the two Koreas. He even used the word that the détente is a global hot wind, but it can unleash the local wind that would spark a war on the Korean Peninsula. So maybe we can trace the evolution of American strategy narratives and how it made the evolution in ways that incorporate the strategic concerns about its minor partners. And finally, for Claudia, I think it's a really big contribution to the status literature. So you challenge the conventional wisdom that associates status seeking or higher status with positive attributes of each country. So you turn this argument in a different direction, and I think it's a very big contribution. But one concern here is that victimhood-based status seeking, you briefly mentioned in the last slide of your presentation, but victimhood-based status seeking can reinforce the existing status hierarchy. So you mentioned that South Korea's adherence to victimhood status can raise doubts from the United States and Japan about its willingness to cooperate with these two countries against Beijing or Pyongyang. But on the other hand, your argument implicitly assumes that this victimhood-based status-seeking states recognize the authority of these higher or elite powers, like the Western countries that constitute the core of the international society. So I think maybe we should talk more about this the glass ceiling part in world politics.
All right, from here on in, you don't have to have 4 questions. You can just ask 1 question, right?
Thank you very much for your insightful questions. I definitely agree with that one country has multiple narratives at the same time. This is my remaining question for this research. So my question was that without Yoon's controversial decision to labor force issues, was it possible for South Korea and Japan relations can improve the level, even the existence of Indo-Pacific narratives? So during the Yoon administration, I think we all agree that there was reduced narratives about South Korea's victimhood to Japan. So I think it might be influenced its relationship between the two countries. So maybe I keep looking at what will happen in this new administration narratives. My impression is this new administration, until now, not that emphasized South Korea's victimhood in government narratives, but still Indo-Pacific narrative has gone. So I want to look at the implications of this interplay between two narratives. And about China, China is definitely driving force for South Korea and Japan's cooperation during the Yoon administration. But there are exact difference between how Japan perceive China and how South Korea perceive Japan. China. So for Japan, there is a sort of national consensus about China. So regardless whether it's opposition party or leading party or that's liberal or conservatives, they admit China as a national challenge, security challenge, and the government documents has already admitted that. But South Korea, I think there is some nuance, and there are threat perception between conservative and liberals. And So for this administration, I have already observed it try not to clearly describe China as a threat. So so there will be some changes how Japan and South Korea approach China in their cooperation narratives. Thank you.
Awesome. And I really love the way our questioner was writing down notes that whole time. That's like so professional, man. And everybody up here, you're all nodding heads. That's like so professional as well. Joe, your turn.
Thank you. Thank you for your interesting question. Yeah. How the THAAD affected China's policymakers' perception of South Korea and East Asia? I think China it affected China's perception of South Korea in a way that is reflected in what China had offered to South Korea in 2017. That was three no's to THAAD, right? And the three no's included, South Korea not joining, not additionally deploying THAAD in the future, and not to join the U.S.-led military missile defense system, right? And not to further develop, trilateral military cooperation among, the United States, Japan, and Korea. And I think that really speaks volume here, and it is quite self-evident in that, China was worried about the consequences of South Korea deploying THAAD for these reasons. And apparently, the third one is really the most worrisome to China's interest. And after that, their rhetoric has not only been, emphasizing, respecting the three no's that South Korea had promised with China, but also it extended to some warnings like uh, South Korea should not damage China's interests for the interest of the third party. And the second one would be I just mentioned in my presentation too. Uh, you cannot be influenced by external factors, for your own decision making, and that apparently implies the United States, and so and the consequences, it actually had worked to my dismay, because whenever there was a pressure or stern warning from coming from Beijing, we have witnessed the South Korean presidents or government or the politicians have all been subservient to China's demands, unfortunately. And in our media, it was coined as quiet diplomacy, subservient diplomacy, and China conscious diplomacy, and so forth. And that is quite unfortunate for Korea, if it desires to be, remain, sovereign state. And I think this is where the challenge arises for South Korea to continue to develop its relationship with China. It has to emancipate from itself from the, all these uh, bad behaviors that it has developed as a result of, China's pressure and warnings over the years. Thank you.
Thank you for your good comments. Actually, I'm looking at that kind of theoretical mechanism, whether it's a kind of narrative or kind of material kind of aid from the United States. So what I'm doing at this now, because this project is kind of ongoing, still developing. So I'm looking at the nature of this military aid, whether it's based on the nationalist motivations or it is kind of imposed by the United States at the expense of South Korea's fiscal constraints. So depends on what is the nature of the actually that fiscal kind of capability. Then I will kind of figure out which one is actually better explains the role of the retrenchment narrative. So thank you for your comments.
And online, Claudia?
Yeah, thank you, Jae-young, and nice to see you here. I guess my answer for now is that I'm like trying to feel like conceptual holes in my argument right now, and I'm trying to. I guess the answer that I've come up with is that the degree to which victimhood claims can be contained or tamed, right? I think it has to do with whether a state sees elite power as an aspirational goal or not, and how much they are willing to be or they want to be incorporated into the Western core-led liberal international order. So, for example, Russia and China make victimhood claims all the time, but in a way that are not easily contained, right? And also in ways that provoke much resistance from the Western core, right? And I think they are possible. They can do that precisely because they are capable of forming like a counter audience. They are, capable of. They have a different audience that is not limited to the Western core, right? Russia has, Belarus and other, some of former Soviet countries. China has, economic influence over some weaker Asian states that would not, oppose its own victimhood claims and so on and so forth. And they can afford to sort of remain outside of the liberal international order in ways that Japan and South Korea do not wish to be. I do think that Japan for sure and Korea, to a lesser extent, maintain this desire regardless of who's in charge of the government, have this desire to be seen as part of the liberal international order. So I think the degree to which a state's victimhood claims can be contained depends on this aspirational goal. I don't know if that answers your question, but thank you.
Awesome. Some questions from the audience? Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, I'm Shohan. I'm from India. I'm an upcoming graduate student at SNU GSIS. I have a question for Dr. Lee. In a basic understanding of like shared identity or we-ness, especially from a Wendtian constructivist framework, like it usually stems from in-grouping and out-grouping of nations. So like if we disclude the common interest, like in context of South Korea and Japan, if we disclude the common interest idea, like balancing against North Korea, or like balancing towards the strategic alliance with US. So what kind of we-ness, like on what basis a grouping could take place between Korea and Japan? Because if we just think of the Indo-Pacific identity that that South Korea has been having a pushback against it, as presented by other presenters as well. So like on what basis could a we-ness form between South Korea and Japan, excluding the security frameworks against North Korea or towards US itself?
Thank you. Thank you for your interesting question. My idea is that Indo-Pacific, as an Indo-Pacific nation, and Japan and South Korea faced common challenges of their rules and order. So in that sense, they are in group, and out group is challenging that rules and order. So they can establish winners between two countries, but I'm still think it's too early to talk about we-ness or re-identity between the two countries because of some victim narratives or other sensitive issues. Thank you.
Okay, so Janelle, you're like one question ahead of everyone else. So I always, when I'm on a panel, think, oh, who's winning? Who's winning? Who's got the most questions? You're winning. Go ahead.
Thank you. I have one brief question to Professor Chu. Because of the time limitation, you skipped about the Xi Jinping's aggressive narratives towards South Korea. So, if you don't mind, would you give us a chance to learn more about the Chinese aggressive stance or narratives towards our country?
To your question, Dr. Kevin, I cannot go into every detail, but there's plenty of cases and plethora of statements, coming from Beijing. And if you're interested, I can share my slides, and hopefully, my work can be published as a paper, so that I can go into really details and introduce all the statements on all domains of China's rhetorics and narratives. Uh, yes, but what stands out the most is uh, I'm personally very much impressed with the way Xi Jinping confronted Moon Jae-in at G20 Osaka summit meeting in June of 2019. I think that was, a really disgraceful moment for South Korea. He said it right before his face. You shouldn't. You should make your own decision and not to be influenced by the United States. And if you cannot solve the that issue, then there's no progress with our relationship. And that's there's nothing you can really say up front, before another state's leader at an official meeting, and China doesn't seem to care. And there's so many cases like that, and even Foreign Minister Wang Yi, I pointed out in so many cases, but Wang Yi also said the same thing. With not only President Moon, but also at the time Korean Foreign Minister. And Wang Yi just basically said, even to President Moon, that you should not join the IPAF, and it had an implication to Indo-Pacific strategy too. And I think Sheena pointed out a great deal of South Korea at the time Moon administration declaring that it is not going to join uh, Indo-Pacific strategy that is introduced by Japan in November 2017. I think that's really a key point here, because three no's and THAAD was supposedly agreed on October 31st to be exact, of 2017. And Moon was scheduled to visit Beijing in the first week of December of that year. And in between, there was a question raised whether South Korea is going to join the Indo-Pacific strategy. And Moon was really conscious of, going to Beijing. Supposedly, he wanted a state visit, but he couldn't get the state visit. But he ended up staying there for a week. And, he could not but deny that, Korea's interested in Indo-Pacific strategy. And here we can see a subservient posture when it comes to China matters.
Another question from the audience? Yeah, please.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Daniela Mazu. I'm from Brazil. I have a question for Professor, actually, Claudia Kim. And, well, the Republic of Korea is a very young agent in the global arena. So probably the way they are trying to show the world their side of history is reminding them of what happened here and its impact. Japan is a strong historical agent with influence within the Western core, and of course, has an imperialistic past. So now Korea is gaining more space and getting back the control over their own narrative. So maybe isn't it important to claim and show that they were a victim, especially because Korea has been silenced and or shadowed for so long?
Well, thank you so much. And I totally agree. So I'm not necessarily criticizing victimhood claiming per se, but I focus more on the competitive dynamics of victimhood politics and how it relates to status pursuits, because Korea certainly and Japan, obviously, they sort of approach this issue of victimhood in kind of a zero-sum kind of way, where they sort of compete over indirectly and directly at the same time they treat their own victimhood in a competitive manner without, acknowledging the others' suffering. And I think that is the problematic part. At least that's how I see it. And I think your comment about how South Korea is a young country, it's trying to, voice to the world, what happened to it, and taking control of its own narrative. Oh, for sure, right? We have the whole democratic transition, the end of the Cold War, the diffusion of human rights norms, all these factors, they come together and create a situation, create an environment in which South Korea can finally talk about its own victimhood, right? So that in itself is a positive development, and victimhood can actually empower many formerly victimized countries, right? So I guess what I'm trying to talk about in my book is more of a byproduct of that proliferation of victimhood and sort of like a cynical and strategic uses of victimhood, rather than victimhood as a means of self. I don't know. I mean, I'm not denying that victimhood is a real thing, right? But I guess my focus is more on the competitiveness and the lack of nuanced view of victimhood when it's used in a cynical and strategic and instrumental way. And I don't know, if you look at Korea's domestic politics, it's so prevalent. The usage, the partisan appropriation of victimhood is so intense that it actually doesn't seem to help the original victims. So there are victims, and then there is a victim nation, right? And I think one of the motivations for writing this book is that, a nation posturing as a victim nation on the world stage does not necessarily help the individuals who are actually victimized in the first place. So that's just my thought process. Thank you.
Alrighty, and that's dead on 11:30, perfect timing. I want you to thank all of our presenters. They did an excellent job. And of course, you're welcome to come up and ask them questions afterwards, because I'm sure some of you have questions and you were just a little bit afraid to ask in front of everyone else. Fair enough. But thank you all, and for being a great audience. Thank you.